Hello and welcome to What Could Go Wrong, a review of research for non-researchers. I'm delighted to see you here. My name is Dr. Chris Wildermuth. My picture is there on the screen with my dog Buffy. I'm an associate professor at Drake University where I lead the Master of Science in Leadership Development. Just a little bit about the program that I lead here at Drake University. It's designed for working adults, so it's very flexible. You take classes on Fridays and Saturdays. You can take one course at a time or two courses at a time, depending on what you prefer. The program is based on our own leadership competency model. And you can choose concentrations in leadership or talent development. If you pick one of those two concentrations, you complete the program in 30 credit hours, or actually that translates into 10 courses, less than 2 years if you take two courses at a time. Many of our students choose both of these concentrations, in which case it's 36 credit hours, which is the standard number of credit hours for a master's program. So if you're interested in any of that, or if you think somebody in your organization may be, please direct them to drake.edu/leadership on the screen or have them contact me. If you're looking for the PowerPoint presentations for the PowerPoint slides for this presentation, you can go to my page, professorwildermuth.com, and you can specifically go to the area that says resources and then webinar materials, and you see the PowerPoint, and the recording is usually available about 24 hours later. One thing that if you've been in my webinars before, you hear that that I like to call it a kitchen conversation because I don't script webinars. I think read webinars are horrendously boring. People can tell that you're reading. So the downside of that, of course, is that you're going to hear some ums and some ahs and some imperfections because the imperfections come with not having the whole thing scripted. Even though if you're watching this, you're actually watching the recording of the webinar, it's at a couple of points in time in the program, I might ask you to pause the tape and think about how you would respond to that question, because that will keep you more engaged as you go through it. And I keep quite a bit of flexibility in my webinars, but if you're watching the recording, I probably will have gone through the entire thing. All right, so here is my roadmap. Here are the topics that I'm planning to cover. First, we're going to discuss ethics of research. Very often when we think about research in organizations, we forget that there are certain rules for research that, yes, technically only apply to federally approved research. I'm going to talk to you about what's the difference, but as leaders, we should consider the ethics of our research anyway. So we'll discuss some of the ethics of research involving human subjects. The next topic is design and the bias that could creep in the design. And next, I'm going to address the topics of validity, reliability, and all that jazz, specifically validity and reliability of instruments that you may use in your research. So let's start with some basic terminology. And my first term, the first definition, I guess, that I'd like to offer is, what do I mean when I say research? Because when I say research, oftentimes people think of folks completing their PhD, or people like me who have to conduct some research for a living. And actually, what I'm meaning by research, my own definition here for the purposes of this webinar only, is any data collection and analysis that involves human subjects or human beings. Okay, now that is not the federal definition. And what I mean by the federal definition is that when we talk about the kind of research that is federally regulated, then I looked in the Drake website and I looked specifically for the kinds of research activities that require our institutional review board or the ethics board review and approval, and that's the definition that I found in there. Research is a systematic investigation that includes research development, testing, and evaluation, and is intended to develop or contribute to general knowledge. And I'm going to emphasize those words, systematic and intended to develop or contribute to general knowledge. So normally when we're talking about the kind of research that would have to be approved and that would have to follow very strict ethics guidelines, we're talking about research that is going to be, that we're trying to conduct to generalize to larger to a larger population. So we investigate a small sample and a smaller sample, and we try to generalize to a larger group of people. When you conduct research in your organization, you're not trying to contribute to general knowledge or generalize to a larger population. You're just trying to find out what's going on in your organization. So technically, that type of research does not match the definition for federal research guidelines, and therefore you would not be bound by the same ethics rules. Now, why does this matter? Because federal guidelines are only protecting what I call research with a capital R, and I'm just trying to, this is my own distinction, okay? I call research with a capital R, research with a small r, with research with a capital R being the type of research that I just defined, the type of research that is a systematic investigation that contributes to general knowledge, and research with a small r is the research that we do in organizations. So the federal guidelines only protect the research with a capital R ethics, not the research in organizations. And yet, I'm sure you would agree that ethics is an important topic for all of us. So for starters, I'd like you to start thinking about what kinds of organizational research have you observed? Can you think of any research with a small r that you have seen? And even before you start thinking about it, I'm just going to give you some ideas. If you have ever been engaged in a 360 process, that's research. If you have ever completed an engagement survey in your organization, that's research. Any kind of data collection in your organization that involves human beings is research. So with that said, pause the tape now and think about types of organizational research that you have observed. Okay, so hopefully you have thought of some research that occurs in your organization, any kind of evaluation, any kind of performance appraisal, any kind of best place to work surveys, pretty much anything that collects data with human subjects that you may not have thought about in terms of, oh, wow, this is research. It has to be valid. It has to be reliable. The instrument has to be right. There shouldn't be bias in the design and so on. And that's what this presentation is all about. I am not worried about official researchers in universities. I'm worried about people like you. All right, so let's start talking about ethics. When we talk about federal research guidelines, there are three major guidelines that we consider, or three major principles that we consider. The first is respect for persons, the second is beneficence, and the third is justice. So let's see what each of these mean. The first one is respect for persons. And when we talk about respect for persons, we're usually thinking about people who participate in research as autonomous agents. And if they are autonomous agents, if they have autonomy, they should be giving informed consent. Now, I know what you're thinking. You may be thinking, well, there's not so much autonomy. Sometimes you just have to do things in research. In organizations, you're just compelled to do some things. Hold on, I'm going to get there in a moment. So let's, in a perfect world, assume that the people who are participating in research, even inside the organization, have perfect autonomy. So what do I mean by perfect autonomy? The first thing that I mean is that they are reaching an informed decision. So if they are participating in a research study, they know exactly why they are participating in a research study, and they know what the research study they're participating in is all about. They are not being coerced to participate against their will, which basically means that they can say no. And that leads to the idea of the informed consent. So if you've ever participated in any kind of study in which the first page had all those questions, here are the things you should know about this study, blah, 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 blah. This is going to take you X minutes, and this is what the study is all about, and so on. What you were given was an informed consent form. So here are some of the things that we usually involve in an informed consent form. What's the study all about? How long will it take the person to complete the instrument, the questionnaire, or participate in the focus group, or participate in the interview? What are the risks, really the risks? And you have to really consider risks that you may not immediately have thought of. What is going to be the benefits for the person who's participating and for the organization at large if we're thinking about an organization? When we think about that in terms of research with a capital R, then it's what are the benefits for society at large? And we always have to weigh the benefits and the risks. It's not that we never do anything that has some risk, it's that we don't take unnecessary risks. Another question is, what's going to happen with the results? Who is going to see the results? What happens if the person says no? Who has access to the data? How long is the data capped? So these are all the questions that people should have an answer to. Now, to what extent can the principle of respect for a person's connected to autonomy? That's why I'm calling it just one principle, because the principle is respect for persons. Autonomy is embedded in there. To what extent can it be applied in organizational research? Well, the reality is sometimes in organizations, we just have to participate in something. So for example, I may not have the choice to engage or not in a 360 assessment that is designed for everybody in my particular role. I may not have the choice to participate or not in a performance appraisal, even though technically those things could be considered research. However, I would say I should have the choice to participate or not in an engagement survey or in the best places to work, or so on. So I would say, to what extent can the principle of respect for persons be applied in organizational research? As much as possible. So even if there is no way for the person to say no, keep in mind that whenever somebody cannot say no, you may not be able to trust the results so much. And even if the person cannot say no, that doesn't mean the person cannot be fully informed. So basically, keep in mind that any coercion is likely to invalidate your results. You can force somebody to respond to a survey. You cannot necessarily force somebody to respond to a survey truthfully. And if the person is not fully comfortable with what is going to happen with those results, you cannot trust the truthfulness of the results, which will get to the issues of validity that we will discuss later. So, how much do you respect people's autonomy? Again, as much as you possibly can. And this is definitely something for you to consider in any kind of research that you're conducting in your organization. The second major principle is beneficence. And basically what that principle has to do is with the idea that you maximize the benefit-harm ratio. You maximize the benefits and you minimize the risks. You understand that risks always exist, even in the most benign research. There's going to be some risk involved, but you don't take unnecessary risks, and you do whatever you can to protect the people who are participating in your study. Something that I like to share with colleagues, with my graduate students when we're working on research studies, is the first thing is you do no harm. And especially you don't do any unnecessary harm that has no benefits and could easily be prevented. So the big question to ask is the study important enough to justify potential risks, and how can you minimize those risks? The next piece of the puzzle is justice. So when we talk about justice, we're talking about whether we're splitting the benefits and the risks of the study equitably. Are we selecting people to participate in the subject fairly, or are we just conveniently doing so? An example of a convenient selection of subjects is when, for example, we run a 360 assessment in our organization, and we just select a few people to participate in the study because 360s are expensive and we really just want a small group of people. Well, if a manager has, 40 reports and you're selecting 3 from a from a design standpoint, you have a problem in there because you can't really extrapolate from 3 to 40. So how are you deciding who is participating in your process? Or, for example, if you've decided to do a 360 in your organization and only the top leaders are participating, could that be excluding some people who could benefit from the study? And is there any way in which you could find maybe a more efficient, a less costly, or some other alternative tools that would allow you to involve more people? So another question here is, are you systematically or inadvertently, just because you didn't think about it, excluding people who could benefit from the study? So that's the principle of justice. So in summary, these are the three concepts: respect, beneficence, and justice, where respect means a concern about the autonomy of the individual and the idea of informed consent. Beneficence means an appropriate ratio between benefits and risks, and justice means fairness in attribution of risks and benefits. All right, so that takes us to the second topic today, which is the issue of bias in the design. So the question in here is, what kinds of biases could be impacting your research design? And I'm going to be giving you some examples of biases that could come up even in organizational research, such as, for example, performance appraisals. Performance appraisals, by the way, are loaded with bias. All right, first one is social desirability. People answer what the researcher wishes to see. So if, for example, you share a, I don't know, best places to work study, but before the study you are inadvertently or sometimes even purposely sending the message that you want your organization to get a good score, then you can no longer trust what the heck the results are going to be. And the same goal for engagement or employee satisfaction. If there is any kind of subtle pressure for the employees to answer in a particular way so that a department looks good or a division looks good, needless to say, you cannot trust what you're going to get from there. And even if you don't do anything obvious, as in say, hey people, let's make us look good over here, there could still be that desire from people to answer what they think you want to see. In engagement surveys, for example, if you start asking questions about, how proud people are of the organization or how hard they work, you're going to see some bias in the way that people answer, because nobody wants to say, hey, me, I am a total slacker. I am completely lazy. I do absolutely nothing. Okay, so social desirability is an issue for you to consider in any kind of research. The next issue is history. Would it have happened anyway? I am particularly fond of studies that contrast, for example, the performance of a team before and after a team building initiative, except that the pre-test before the team building initiative occurs, say, in January, and the post-test occurs a year later because they want to see how much the team improved. Well, after a year, teams tend to settle down. So if that was a new team and that team was in a storming phase in which they were all fighting, there's a possibility that that team would have gotten better anyway. So that's the question that we ask in history. Is it the intervention that you did, or is it something that would have happened that history would have taken care of? The third one is primacy, and that has to do with the fact that we tend to remember the first thing that we saw or we heard. So, for example, if we have a new employee and that new employee messes up right away, we tend to remember that first mess up. If the employee, on the other hand, was amazing the first time, the very first evaluation, that tends to impact the way that we see that employee later on. And then you have the close colleague of primacy, which is recency. We tend to remember the last thing the employee did. So performance appraisals could be particularly prone to that problem, because if an employee was really good throughout the entire year, but lo and behold, in the last month, the employee made a serious mistake, the tendency of the manager is to ignore everything else that happened before then. And human beings are prone to those kinds of cognitive biases. So primacy and recency are important components here. And the last bias that I'm going to address is testing or learning from the test. So, for example, if you apply the same engagement survey every year, and people already know what those questions lead to and what's going to happen after they complete the evaluation, then they could start answering in a certain way because of a combination of learning what it is that you want. So you combine a little bit with social desirability bias here. As I gave some examples, you may already have started thinking about the sorts of biases that you have experienced or observed in organizational research. So once again, just for you to kind of wake up and think about some of the experiences that you've had, I will suggest that you stop and take a few notes on biases that you have experienced or observed in organizational research. All right, welcome back. Let's talk about validity, reliability, and all that jazz, which is the kind of stuff that usually researchers would include in a research report, or that vendors, when you purchase instruments from a consultant, should be including in their own research reports for their own instruments. So specifically here, I'm talking about the validity and the reliability of the instrument that you're using. And again, by an instrument, I don't necessarily just mean a questionnaire. I could be meaning a interview protocol, the questions that you're going to ask in a focus group, or so on. So I'm going to start with the test example. And this is, these are questions that all relate to a particular component of engagement. And here we go. Eu me esforço muito para fazer o melhor trabalho possível. And by the way, you're supposed to strongly agree, agree, neutral, disagree, strongly disagree. It's one of those instruments, okay? All right, so let me read the first sentence again. Eu me esforço muito para fazer o melhor trabalho possível. Eu tenho muito orgulho da minha empresa. Eu faço mais pela minha empresa do que me pedem. Eu recomendo a minha empresa para todos os meus amigos. Os meus valores são consistentes com os da minha empresa. Okay? You ready to agree or disagree with those items? All right. Now, unless you speak Portuguese or maybe Spanish and you're able to kind of make sense of what's in there, this is Portuguese, but sometimes if you speak Spanish, you're able to understand by cognates. But if you speak neither Portuguese nor Spanish, you probably have no idea what I'm saying in many of these items in there. So what was supposed to be an instrument on specifically a combination of organizational pride and what we call role expansion, which are two components of organizational engagement. Well, whatever it is that you answer, I have no idea if you have organizational pride or a role expansion because the items were in Portuguese. So in this case, instead of, I thought I was asking you questions on organizational pride and role expansion, but what I'm actually asking you are questions on whether you speak Portuguese or not. And that takes us to the idea of the validity of a study. Specifically, and we're going to specifically talk about the validity of the instrument that is used within a study. So what do I mean by the validity of an instrument? What we're talking about here is, does your instrument really answer the question you wanted to ask? So if my research question in the example that I just gave was, what is your organizational pride and your role expansion? How willing are you to, how proud are you of your organization? Do your organization's values match your own? Are you willing to do your all for your organization? Are you willing to take the initiative to go above and beyond? Those were kinds of I can't remember exactly, but those were kinds of the questions that I had. Well, if I don't ask those questions in a language you can't understand, then what my instrument is really asking is if you understand that language and not the question that I was trying to ask. Of course, that's an extreme example, but that gives you a sense of what validity means. And there are multiple types of validity. I'm just going to address a few. I'm going to address construct validity, face validity, predictive validity, and concurrent validity. When you look in a report, you can see some of these types of validity. You can see other types of validity. And here's a caveat. Depending on the book that you go to or the source, sometimes you see slightly different definitions to these types of validity. So let's first take a look at construct validity. I'm going to share with you once again an example of a survey, and that should be a survey on engagement. So here we go. This time it's in English. Do you have friends at work? How satisfied are you with your salary? How satisfied are you with your benefits? So my question is, does this instrument have construct validity? What construct validity has to do is whether you are really measuring the construct. A construct is a variable that is invisible, that you can't see. Are you really analyzing the construct of engagement? And I would argue that no, you are not, because engagement is different from job satisfaction. So the fact that people are satisfied with their salary and satisfied with their benefits does not mean that they are engaged. The question, do you have friends at work, is a little more complicated. It is true that there is a relationship between having friends at work and being engaged. That's something that has been identified by the Gallup organization, and also having friends at work may increase feelings of safety. Those things enhance engagement. The problem, though, is that people could be highly engaged and not have friends at work for a variety of reasons. Maybe they're new, maybe they're isolated in a particular office, I don't know. So there could be some noise in that particular question. But the main problems here are the second and the third questions, because they have really nothing to do with engagement at all. They have to do with job satisfaction. Is there some relationship between job satisfaction and engagement? Yes, there is some relationship, but these are different constructs. So we would say that this particular instrument lacks construct validity. So one of the things that you would want to know is that there is some kind of information in the report that is included in your study that addresses construct, addresses the construct validity, that actually lets you know whether the construct that is being analyzed is has been appropriately researched. So there's usually some kind of background information, some kind of a literature review that you can see that the person who designed the study really knows what he or she is talking about. All right, so we've already reviewed what construct validity means. Now let's take a look at other types of validity. Face validity basically has to do with whether people think that the research, that the questionnaire makes sense to them. And if the research instrument does not make sense, it doesn't look like it holds water, what basically happens is that people can become less interested in answering the research. It's kind of an interesting balance here, because on the other hand, if the questions are too obvious, then you fall into social desirability bias. So you have to balance those two needs. But that's basically what face validity means. Predictive validity has to do, well, with the predictive power of the instrument. So if you are running some kind of, I don't know, personality assessment when you hire employees for a particular position, and you are hoping that that assessment is going to predict people's success in a particular position, then you'd better be doing some good ongoing data collection in your organization to make sure that in your organization and within your organizational culture, those particular personality traits that the vendor swore to you would connect to a particular job actually do hold water in your organization, because cultural issues and specific issues in organizations may change those results. I'm not going to focus too much on personality as a selection tool today. I'm just saying for now that if you're using personality assessments or any kind of selection tools for that matter, you should be conducting your own ongoing research to make sure that the tools that you're using have predictive validity for your particular purposes. And finally, when we talk about concurrent validity, we're usually contrasting and comparing a particular study with a particular questionnaire, with another questionnaire that is considered, I guess, the standard in the field. So for example, I do a lot of work around personality. The standard in the field is considered the NEO. So many times when you have new personality assessments, the authors will report the relationship or the correlation between their study and the NEO. So you should look for some kind of evidence, if it is a new instrument, that that instrument has some kind of relationship with the instruments that are considered the strongest in the field. At all events, we already talked about the need to look for the validity section. Different research reports for instruments are going to include different information, but there should be something in there. There should be some information on validity. And what's important here is for you not to confuse validity with reliability. So what is reliability? Let's talk about that. So reliability has to do with the general consistency of the instrument. And I'm going to talk, just like validity, there are various types, but I'm going to talk specifically of two types of reliability. Test-retest reliability is the first one, and that has to do with the consistency. If you take an instrument today and you take the instrument tomorrow and you take the instrument 3 months from now, then you should have the same answer. So for example, if I ask an average adult, what's your favorite color? You're probably going to answer the same way every time, right? Personality instruments, for example, they should be reasonably reliable. Could there be some changes in adult life? Yes, of course, but some changes don't mean that every time that you take the instrument you come up with a different trait, because then the whole thing would be kind of useless. However, if my test is just to flip a coin, obviously you're not, by definition, you wouldn't get the same result each time, so the test-retest reliability would be terrible. Good instruments are somewhere in between, always being the same. It's very unlikely that it's always going to be the same, and being completely random, which means the instrument is pretty useless. So when you're talking about test-retest reliability, we're looking about similar results. Now, does test-retest reliability always matter? Not necessarily. There are some constructs that are expected to go up and down. So for example, the fact that I completed an engagement survey today and I was very high in engagement, and then you give it to me again next week and I'm lower, does not necessarily mean that your engagement survey is terrible, because engagement is expected to go up and down. In fact, some of the experts on engagement suggest that what we should be doing is testing in various occasions and then coming up with some sort of a time design series and seeing how it varies, instead of just doing it once a year and calling it a day. But at all events, my point here is that with certain constructs, it's okay for things to move. With some others, such as personality, for example, you would expect some consistency. So that's test-retest reliability. That should appear in the report of whatever instrument you're purchasing out there. And if it's an instrument that you're designing, then you should consider having that kind of study. The next one is internal consistency. And what internal consistency has to do is the consistency of parts of your study, not parts of your study, I apologize, parts of your instrument with other parts of your instrument. So do the items within your instrument relate to one another? And I'm going to have an extroversion instrument here as an example. First question is, how sociable are you? Do you enjoy going out with friends? Do you speak more than you listen? Are you outgoing? Okay, so far, I've come up with items that if you are an extrovert, you would probably agree with most of these. Could there be some variation? Yes, it's possible that you're sociable and enjoy going out with friends, but you've learned not to speak more than you listen. It's possible that you consider yourself outgoing, but maybe you don't have many friends. I don't know. There are some variations. I'm not saying that everything is going to be exactly the same answer. However, let's say that I add these questions here. Do you go out for dinner with your friends often? And do you travel a lot? All right, now you have a problem, because you could have an extrovert who happens to have no money, and that person would not go out for dinner all the time or travel a lot. Or maybe somebody is extroverted and has money, but has some constraints that that person cannot travel. Or maybe that person has just moved to a new town and hasn't met any friends yet. So what's happening here is that one part of the instrument is not going to come up with the same results that the other part of the instrument. And what that usually indicates is that the two parts of your instrument are actually asking different questions. So to a certain extent, a reliability problem could also suggest a validity problem. There are two different questions being asked here, and that's why people's answers are so all over the place. We use the alpha coefficient, which is a measure of internal consistency. So if you see in a research report, the alpha was a 0.75, for example, what that means is that that's a measure of the internal consistency. For the purposes of this presentation, I'm not going to go through the mathematical formula that, that generates the alpha coefficient. It suffices to tell you that the alpha coefficient matters, because what it's telling you is that there is a reasonable internal consistency in your instrument, or there isn't. So how high are you looking for? I just said that you could get a 0.75, right? So how high must the alpha be? Well, let me go back here. Here's the thing. If your alpha is 1, like there's a perfect consistency, you have kind of a I'll have an example coming up, but you have like a question, a test in which you're basically asking exactly the same question over and over and over again. And if your alpha is too low, then what that suggests is that you could be asking different questions in there. So usually we look for alphas above a 0.7, somewhere between 0.7, 0.8, 0.85. If it starts getting too high, you may be asking the same question over and over again. Like, do you like pie? Pie, do you like? It's like the Yoda test. Star Wars test of whatever, of extroversion. Is having a high alpha enough? So if the alpha, the vendor tells you, and our alpha for this test on personality, extroversion specifically, is a 0.9, so this is great. Well, not necessarily. So let's look at my extroversion test here. Do you like chocolate? Do you enjoy chocolate? If you could, would you eat more chocolate? Is chocolate enjoyable to you? And are you fond of chocolate? All right, first of all, I created a Yoda test here, right, in which I'm asking the same question. Do you like chocolate? Chocolate like you? Do you enjoy chocolate? Enjoy you the chocolate? You're basically asking the same question over and over again. But also, liking chocolate has nothing to do with an extroversion test. And yet, that instrument would have a very high alpha, because probably people who say they like chocolate would also say that chocolate is enjoyable to them. So in summary, you don't want a test that is reliable but invalid. You want both. You want a test that is both valid and reliable. All right. So we've gone through a lot of stuff. We talked about the ethics of a research, the concepts of respecting people, of protecting them from harm, of being just and fair in your research. We've talked about the types of bias that could creep in your study. And then we talked about the importance of validity and reliability, and how your instruments, even instruments used internally for whatever studies you do, should be both valid and reliable. So here are a few final words of wisdom. Whenever you purchase a research instrument from anybody, ask for a research report. There should be one. And there should be information in there about construct validity, about reliability. There should ideally be some kind of a test, retest reliability information in there, unless, like I said, it's the type of construct such as engagement in which people are supposed to vary anyway. Beware of exaggerated claims, especially regarding predictive validity. So if somebody says, we have this perfect instrument that is going to predict, just people take this personality instrument and I can tell you whether they're going to be successful leaders or they're going to be successful salespeople, be careful, because it is really complicated. People are very complex. Organizational cultures vary. So something that has been researched in other organizations may or may not apply to yours. So be careful with exaggerated claims and be ready to do your own internal research, especially when you're making important employment decisions based on whatever instrument you're going to be using. Collaborate with academic research. Sometimes one way for you to reduce the cost of research is people like me, graduate students, PhD, doctoral candidates. They are always looking for samples to conduct their research. And usually there are agreements that can be made. So for example, a researcher will say, hey, I will, if you let me publish these findings without saying anything about your organization, I can just say, it's a Midwestern organization in the service industry. That says pretty much nothing. There are zillions of service organizations in the Midwest. Now you've allowed a researcher to do his or her job, and you may have gotten some free data and some awesome results of an unbiased party. So collaborating with academic research is something that I seldom see organizations do, and it could give you some really good data and some inexpensive and valid instruments. And I'm not saying this to just because I'm recruiting anybody for a study right now, because I really am not. I'm talking about in general with other professors, other researchers, other students, and so on. And finally, remember that not only researchers, such as professors and graduate students and researchers who do that for a living, conduct research. If you have led or authorized or been involved in any kind of data collection involving human beings in your organization, you are involved in research with human subjects, even if you never thought of it that way. So that's all I wanted to say. Thank you so much. If you have any questions on this presentation, please get in touch with me at Drake University. My address is chris.wildermuth@drake.edu. Don't add an H because there's no H to my name. Or come to drake.edu/leadership to learn more about the Master of Science in Leadership Development, or to my academic page, professorwildermuth.com, if you want a copy of this presentation. And that's where I wanted to go today. Thank you so very much. It was a pleasure to record this presentation for you.